They haven't reached out, but they haven't disappeared either. They're still there, quietly watching from the edges. And that's the part that's confusing you. Because real indifference disappears. So if they supposedly moved on, why do they keep finding ways to stay visible? Today, you'll understand the 5 signs an avoidant is silently hoping you break the silence. Here is the reframe that restructures everything you think you're seeing. You've been reading the avoidant's indirect behavior as ambiguity, as signals that could mean something or could mean nothing, impossible to interpret with any certainty. That reading, while understandable, misses the structural reality of what indirect behavior actually communicates in an avoidant's psychology. An avoidant does not accidentally stay visible. Invisibility is one of the primary tools of their defense system. When they are genuinely indifferent, they disappear. Cleanly, completely, without the ambient presence you're currently experiencing. The hovering, the indirect contact, the maintained visibility. None of that is accidental. It is the avoidance attachment system pushing toward connection while their defense system blocks the direct route. This is the hidden mechanism most people miss. Avoidants experience the same attachment needs as everyone else. The difference is that their defense system has classified direct expression of those needs as threatening, as a vulnerability that opens them to rejection, engulfment, or loss of control. So, the need finds indirect channels. It leaks out through behavior that maintains proximity without requiring explicit admission of desire. The 5 signs you're about to understand are not subtle hints open to interpretation. They are specific behavioral outputs of an attachment system that is actively in conflict. One part pushing toward you, one part blocking the direct path. Once you understand the mechanism, the behavior becomes legible. And once it becomes legible, you stop operating from uncertainty and start operating from clarity. Here are the 5 signs, and the psychological architecture underneath each one. The first sign is the phantom presence. They are not reaching out, but they are consistently, repeatedly, almost rhythmically visible on your digital periphery, viewing your content within minutes of it being posted, appearing in the first wave of viewers consistently enough that it cannot be accidental, engaging with things adjacent to your world without engaging with you directly. Externally, this behavior maintains plausible deniability. They haven't said anything, haven't committed to anything, can always claim they just happen to see it. Internally, this is the avoidance attachment system doing the only thing it can do within the constraints the defense system has imposed, staying close without requiring vulnerability. The phantom presence is not passive consumption. It is active monitoring of someone they are not ready to admit they are still oriented toward. The consistency of it, the rhythmic, almost involuntary quality, is what distinguishes it from casual social media behavior. Genuine indifference produces irregular, decreasing engagement over time. The phantom presence produces the opposite, consistent, often increasing proximity that tracks your life without directly entering it. The second sign is the indirect signal broadcast. They are posting things, content, quotes, music, images that carry a specific emotional frequency that you recognize, things that would land differently to someone who shared the context you shared, things that function in the language of your specific connection as messages without a recipient listed. This is not accidental content curation. This is communication through deniable channels. The avoidance defense system cannot permit "I miss you" as a direct statement. The vulnerability of that is beyond what the architecture allows. But "I miss you" encoded in a song posted at 2 a.m., in a quote about regret, in a reference only you would fully understand, that the architecture can permit. Because if it's never acknowledged directly, it can never be directly rejected. The indirect signal broadcast is the avoidance version of reaching out. It is reach without risk. And the fact that it is aimed at your periphery, close enough that you'll see it, calibrated to your specific context, tells you exactly who the intended audience is. Proximity management. The avoidant is maintaining a position within your awareness field without requiring direct contact. They are staying in the landscape of your life, present enough to be noticed, removed enough to maintain deniability. This sign is particularly significant because it requires active effort. Engaging with mutual connections is not passive. It is a choice, made repeatedly in a pattern, that only makes consistent sense if the goal is maintained visibility to a specific person. Genuine detachment produces social behavior that is entirely independent of its potential visibility to you. The mutual connection activation is not independent. It is calibrated. The fourth sign is the nostalgic reference point. In any limited interaction that does occur, a brief exchange, a response to something public, they reference shared history, specific memories, inside references, things that only the two of you would fully understand. This is the most emotionally loaded of the 5 signs because it requires them to reach into the shared archive of the connection and pull something forward, to acknowledge, however briefly, that what existed between you had specific content that they still carry. Nostalgic reference points are not casual. They are deliberate excavations. The avoidance defense system is strict about what gets expressed, and shared memory, with all its intimacy and specificity, does not get referenced casually by someone who is genuinely indifferent. It gets referenced by someone who is thinking about it, and for whom the indirect reference is the only currently permitted form of that acknowledgement. The 5th sign is the timing pattern. Messages, views, signals, whatever form the indirect contact takes, arrive at specific times. Late at night, early morning, weekends. The quiet hours when distraction is thinner and the suppression mechanism is working harder to maintain its load. The timing is not coincidental. It is diagnostic. The avoidant's indirect behavior toward you increases precisely when their defenses are at their lowest, when the noise they've constructed to maintain emotional distance has quieted enough for the underlying data to surface. Late-night phantom presence is not casual consumption. It is someone who is thinking about you in the hours when it's hardest not to. It is the suppression mechanism failing briefly, and the attachment system finding the only outlet the architecture permits. The timing pattern, tracked across multiple instances, is the clearest behavioral evidence that the indirect contact is driven by something that persists when the distractions disappear. Here is the contrast that determines what you do with this information. Most people, upon recognizing these 5 signs, experience a surge of hope that immediately translates into action. They break the silence. They reach out with the warmth that the indirect signals seemed to invite. They offer the reconnection that the avoidance behavior appeared to be asking for. And in doing so, they remove the one thing that was producing the avoidance desperate indirect behavior in the first place. The dynamic resets. The avoidant, having had the silence broken without having to take the risk themselves, regains their comfort and their behavioral leverage simultaneously. The indirect signals stop, not because the longing stopped, but because the anxiety that was producing them has been resolved by your move. What actually maintains the power of your position is receiving the information these signs provide without acting on it immediately or impulsively. You see the signs, you understand what they mean, and you continue operating from the person you've been building during the silence, not as a strategy, but as a genuine commitment to your own standard. The avoidant's silent desperation is real. But real desperation that never has to become accountable desperation produces no change. It simply produces more indirect behavior until you break and re-engage on their terms. The question is not whether they want you to break the silence. The question is whether what they're offering, indirect signals, deniable proximity, carefully maintained vulnerability, meets the standard of what you actually require. 5 principles for how you hold your position when the silent begging is visible. The first is signal documentation. Before you interpret, document. Notice the pattern across multiple instances, the frequency, the timing, the content. Pattern recognition requires data points, not single events. A single view on your story means nothing. Consistent, rhythmic, contextually calibrated presence across weeks means something specific. Let the pattern accumulate before you draw conclusions. This prevents both false positives and the dismissal of genuine signals. The second is emotional regulation before response. The moment you recognize the signs, your nervous system will produce a response: hope, anxiety, the pull to act. That response is real, and it deserves acknowledgement in a private space, not in the dynamic. Process what you feel before you decide what to do. The decision about whether and how to respond should come from your grounded self-assessment, not from the emotional surge that recognition produces. The third is standard application. Apply the same standard to indirect signals that you would apply to direct ones. If someone reached out directly and said, "I've been thinking about you, but I'm not ready to be accountable for my patterns," would that meet your standard for re-engagement? Indirect signals carry the same content with additional deniability built in. The deniability doesn't upgrade the offer. If anything, it reveals something important about where they currently are in their own process. The fourth is continued forward motion. Whatever you were building during the silence, the momentum, the growth, the life reconfiguring itself around your own standards, do not pause it because the indirect signals have appeared. The silence was never about making them signal. It was about building something real in the space the dynamic occupied. That construction continues regardless of what they're doing at the edges of your peripheral vision. Your trajectory is not contingent on their behavior. The fifth is direct engagement threshold. If you decide that the pattern of signals warrants a response, that you have enough evidence of genuine shift in them to justify re-engagement, then your response must be direct and standard grounded. Not a casual reach out that meets them at the level of deniability they've been operating from. A clear, calm, self-possessed communication that establishes the terms of your re-engagement from the beginning. You don't play at their level of indirectness. You bring the conversation into the open on your terms, or you don't bring it at all. Here is where the understanding becomes identity. Reading the 5 signs is useful. Understanding the mechanism is useful. But the version of this work that actually transforms you is not the part where you decode their behavior. It's the part where you decide that decoding their behavior is no longer the primary project of your emotional life. You don't scan for signals to know if you matter. You already know if you matter. You don't need their indirect desperation to confirm that the silence has had an impact. You knew the silence would. You don't break your standard because their architecture makes direct vulnerability impossible for them right now. Their limitations are not your responsibility to accommodate at the expense of your own clarity. You don't interpret indirect contact as sufficient. You know what direct, accountable engagement looks like. You know the difference between someone who is ready and someone who is hovering. You don't mistake someone's inability to stay away for proof that they're ready to show up. Presence and readiness are not the same thing. Here is the final perspective that ties everything together. At the deepest level, the 5 signs of silent begging reveal something true, not just about the avoidant, but about the nature of genuine human need. Even the most defended person, behind the most sophisticated architecture of self-sufficiency, has an attachment system that keeps an honest record. It knows what mattered. It knows what was lost. And in the quiet hours when the defenses are thinnest, it produces behavior aimed at the one thing the defense system claims not to need. That truth is worth knowing. It confirms that what you experienced was real, that what you offered had genuine weight, that the connection was not a performance on your end that landed on indifference on theirs. But knowing it is different from acting on it prematurely. The version of you that holds the silence, not to punish, not to produce indirect signals, but because your standard is real and your time is valuable, is the version that any genuine growth in them would need to meet. Silent begging is the beginning of a process, not the conclusion of one. And the question you need to answer, before you break the silence or decide to hold it, is simply this. Are you responding to who they are right now, or to who you hope the signals mean they're becoming? That distinction is everything.